In 1945, the Speer children were watching Mickey Mouse films at Hitler's mountain retreat. By 1947, their father was a convicted war criminal, and they would not see him for 20 years. But here is what no one expected. When he finally got out, the reunion never came. Instead, Albert Speer spent his freedom building a myth while his children built something else entirely. If you find stories like this fascinating, subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss our next deep dive into the hidden aftermath of World War II. The Alpine paradise that vanished. The Berghof was the closest thing to a fairy tale castle that Nazi Germany could offer. Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps was where the Führer entertained guests, plotted strategy, and projected an image of cultured refinement. And for the Speer children, it was practically a second home. Albert Speer was Hitler's favorite architect, the man who designed the Cathedral of Light at Nuremberg, who dreamed of rebuilding Berlin as Germania, the world capital of a thousand-year Reich. His closeness to Hitler meant his family enjoyed music, privileges few Germans could imagine. The children watched American cartoons with Eva Braun. They took cable car rides up the Kelstein, Hitler's eagle's nest. Years later, Margaret Speer would describe it as an ideal childhood, a phrase that now reads like a confession. Then came May 1945. American troops swept through Germany, and the Speer family home became a target. Soldiers looted everything they could carry. The children watched their possessions disappear into duffel bags. Their father, once among the most powerful men in Europe, was now one of the most wanted. He surrendered to Allied forces and was transported to Nuremberg, where the architects of the Holocaust would face judgment. For the 6 Speer children, Albert Jr., Hildur, Fritz, Margaret, Arnold, and Ernst, the transformation was absolute. 1 month they were Nazi royalty. The next they were the family of a man on trial for crimes against humanity. The sentence that changed everything. At Nuremberg, the prosecutors wanted death. Albert Speer had overseen the use of millions of slave laborers in German war production. Workers from concentration camps, from occupied territories, from prisoner of war camps, all fed into the machine Speer commanded. The evidence was damning. Music, but Speer did something the other defendants did not. He expressed remorse. He claimed he had not known the full extent of the Holocaust. He presented himself as a technocrat who had been blind to the crimes happening around him. The tribunal was split on whether to believe him. In the end, Speer received 20 years at Spandau Prison in Berlin, a sentence that felt like mercy compared to the noose that awaited Goering, Ribbentrop, Music, and the others. But for his wife, Margareta, it may have been worse than widowhood. Music, she now faced 20 years of raising 6 children alone, married to a man who was alive, but completely unreachable, famous but utterly disgraced. The family relocated to Heidelberg, where they faced immediate music and crushing social ostracism. Old friends vanished. Doors that once opened now stayed. Music shut. The children of Albert Speer were guilty by association in a country desperate to forget its recent past. Survival came from an unexpected source. Rudolf Walters, an architect who had worked with Speer during the war, quietly organized what he called the school fund. Wealthy industrialists, men who had profited enormously from Speer's wartime management of armaments production, contributed discreetly over the years. The fund channeled 158,000 Deutsche Marks to the Speer family. It was guilt money filtered through back channels, keeping the wife and children of a war criminal fed and educated while their father counted the days in his cell. The name that had to die. The youngest Speer son was born in 1940 during the height of Nazi power. Music. His parents named him Adolf, a name that in that moment signified loyalty, ambition, music, perhaps even a hope that their son might carry forward something of the Führer's vision. By 1945, that name had become impossible. The decision was bureaucratic but brutal. His parents officially changed his name to Arnold. Music, one form, one signature, and the most visible trace of the family's Nazi past was erased from official records. But you cannot rename a memory. Arnold grew up knowing he had been born Adolf, knowing his parents had chosen that name deliberately, knowing what it meant about who they had been. This single act, changing a child's name, captured something abstract and made it painfully concrete. The Speer children were not just dealing with a father, Music, in prison. They were living with the daily reality of carrying a legacy they had not chosen and could not escape. Growing up criminal, Hilda, the eldest daughter, learned early what her father's name meant in the post-war world. As a teenager, she applied for a visa to visit the United States. Music. The application was denied specifically and explicitly because her father was a convicted war criminal. The rejection made international news. Here was a young woman barely out of childhood when the war ended, being held responsible for crimes she had not committed. Eventually, the decision was reversed, but the damage was done. Hilda understood something her siblings would all learn in their own ways. The world would never see them as individuals first. They would always be Albert Speer's children. The question that haunted them had no answer. Were they guilty by blood? Could they ever be seen as separate from their father's crimes? Different siblings would eventually arrive at radically different conclusions. Letters through prison walls. For 20 years, the only connection between Albert Speer and his children came through paper and ink. Official letters, heavily censored by prison authorities, arrived periodically. But Speer found another way. A sympathetic Dutch orderly named Tony P. became his secret courier. Music, smuggling letters and notes past the guards at Spandau. Through these channels, Speer tried to remain a father from behind walls. He wrote about their educations, their futures, his hopes for them. The children grew up with a father who existed only as handwriting on pages. A voice without a face, a presence without physical reality. Then came October 1st, 1966. Speer had served every day of his 20-year sentence. The gates of Spandau opened and he walked out into a world that had transformed completely since his imprisonment. His children, who had been small when he left, were now adults. Some were married. Some had children of their own. The reunion that had been imagined for 2 decades was finally possible. What happened next would destroy music, any chance of reconciliation, and turn his children against everything he stood for. Albert Speer walked out of Spandau Prison and into a waiting limousine. The media surrounded him. Publishers had already been courting him for years, eager for his memoirs. Within months, he was working on what would become Inside the Third Reich, a book that would sell millions of copies worldwide and establish him as the good Nazi, the one who had not really known, the technocrat who had been swept up in forces beyond his control. His children watched their father choose fame over family. Instead of rebuilding the relationships that had been suspended for 20 years, Speer threw himself into constructing what his daughter Margaret would later call the Speer myth. He gave interviews. He consulted with historians. He became wealthy from book sales and speaking fees, all while maintaining his central claim that he had not known about the Holocaust. The children expected a reunion. What they got was a stranger who seemed more interested in rehabilitating his public image than in reconnecting with the people who had grown up without him. Hilda put it bluntly in later interviews. One by one, my sister and brothers gave up. She said there was no communication. The man who walked out of Spandau was not the father they had hoped for. He was a public figure performing remorse for audiences while offering little to his own family. The architect who rejected his father's shadow. But one of the Speer children found a different path through the wreckage of his inheritance. Albert Speer Jr. became one of the most celebrated architects of his generation in Germany. He designed the central axis of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. He created the master plan for Expo 2000 in Hanover. His work won awards, shaped skylines, and earned the kind of architectural immortality his father had always craved but never achieved. The irony cut deep. Albert Jr. succeeded at exactly what his father had failed to accomplish, creating buildings that would stand and be remembered. He did it while deliberately distancing himself from his father's legacy. Music. In interviews, he said he had tried his whole life to separate himself from his father. The son built what the father only dreamed of, and he built it on a foundation of rejection. Whatever talent he inherited, whatever lessons he absorbed from a father who lived for architecture, he used them while walking away from the man who had given them to him. Music, the daughter who turned shame into fuel, Hilda, took an even more radical approach to her inheritance. She did not just distance herself from her father's legacy. She actively worked to oppose everything he had represented. She became a politician with Germany's Green Party, focusing her career on environmental causes and social justice. In 1994, she received the Moses Mendelssohn Award for her work fighting anti-Semitism in Germany. The daughter of Music, Hitler's architect, honored by a Jewish community organization for combating the hatred her father's regime had weaponized. In 1968, during the music ferment of student activism, Hilda founded a communal household in Berlin. Decades later, that same household would open its doors to Syrian refugees. A direct line connecting her rejection of Nazi ideology to concrete action welcoming the displaced and persecuted. The shame that once got her denied a visa became the engine of her life's work. She transformed inherited guilt into active repair. But one daughter did something even more unexpected with her inheritance. Something that would have horrified her father. The paintings that funded Jewish art. Albert Speer inherited several paintings from Music, her father's collection. These were not just any paintings. Given how her father had accumulated wealth and influence during the Nazi years, there was a real possibility that some of this art was plunder seized from Jewish families, stripped from museums in occupied territories, acquired through the machinery of persecution. Margaret faced a choice for Music. She could keep the paintings, enjoy them quietly, and avoid Music, uncomfortable questions. She could sell them privately and pocket the proceeds. Or she could do something else entirely. She liquidated Music, the collection, and used the money to create a foundation supporting Jewish women's creative projects in Germany. The daughter of Hitler's architect using art that may have been stolen from Jewish families to fund Jewish artists building new work in a country that had tried to exterminate them. The through line was unmistakable. Music, inherited guilt transformed into active repair. A legacy of plunder redirected toward creation. The shadows that never lifted. When Albert Speer died in London on March 1, 1981, he was wealthy from book sales and speaking fees. He had successfully convinced much of the music world that he was the Nazi who had not really known. The good German who had been caught up in something terrible, but had not participated in the worst of it. His children knew different. In 1971, Speer wrote a letter to a Holocaust survivor in which he Music admitted touring the Mauthausen concentration camp and attending Himmler's infamous Music Posen speech, the 1943 address, where Himmler explicitly described the extermination of the Jewish people. The letter confirmed what Music prosecutors at Nuremberg had suspected Speer knew he had always known. Whether his children ever saw that letter remains unclear. What is clear is that the family never reconciled. Fritz, the middle son, left almost no public record of his life. A silence that speaks volumes about his desire to disappear from history. The other children scattered across the world. Baghdad, Chicago, Berlin, Frankfurt, building lives far from their father's shadow. The prison walls came down on October 1, 1966. But the psychological walls never fell. 20 years of absence, followed by 15 years of the Speer myth, left nothing for a family to rebuild on. What the children became. The Speer children's responses to their inheritance diverged radically. Unlike Emmy Goring, Music, who defended her husband until death, or the Braun family, who chose total silence, the Speer children mostly chose active Music rejection. Albert Jr. achieved his father's professional dreams while repudiating his father's life. Hilda transformed shame into activism, winning awards for fighting the anti-Semitism the regime had institutionalized. Margaret funded Jewish artists with Nazi-era art. The others faded into anonymity, declining interviews, refusing to become characters in their father's ongoing mythology. What united them was this. Their father's freedom, Music, brought no family restoration. He walked out of Spandau and immediately began performing remorse for the world while offering almost nothing to the children who had waited 20 years to see him. In the end, Albert Speer got what he wanted, a place in history as something other than a simple monster. His memoirs sold millions. Historians debated his claims for decades. He became the Nazi who might have been different, the one who expressed regret. But his children saw through it. They watched him choose public rehabilitation over private reconciliation. And one by one, they built lives that rejected everything he stood for, turning inherited guilt into something their father never achieved. Genuine atonement. Thanks for watching. If Music, you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into what happened to the families of Nazi leaders after the war. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you do not miss our next upload.